All right. We are continuing on in our discussion of organic molecules. Next up that we're going to be talking about are carbohydrates. And we're going to go very quickly through some of the defining characteristics of carbohydrates, really in terms of the four types of organic molecules for the purposes of our discussion. This group of organic molecules is the simplest and will be the shortest of the lectures. So what exactly are carbohydrates? Well, if we look at the defining characteristics of carbohydrates by a chemical sense, remember that because carbohydrates are one of the four types of organic molecules, that means they have to have a carbon molecule present by definition. And this formula right here shows you exactly what you can expect to see in carbohydrates. You can expect to see that for every one carbon in that molecule of carbohydrate, you will see 2 hydrogens and 1 oxygen. So for example, I could have CH2 would be a carbohydrate with only 1 carbon. This little N here is a multiplier, a factor. So let's say if we put in the number 2 there, then we multiply 2 all the way across, and we would get C2H4O2. If we put a 3 there, we'd get C3H6O3 or C4H8O4. But you can see that the ratio of 1 carbon to 2 hydrogens to 1 oxygen remains consistent regardless of how many carbons you have in the molecule. One of the other defining characteristics of carbohydrates is they have their names ending in OSE. So for example, glucose, sucrose, fructose, galactose, maltose. Okay, those are all examples of carbohydrates, and you'll notice that all of those words end in OSE. That's a tip-off that the word that you're looking at is a carbohydrate. The primary thing that we use carbohydrates for in our body is a quick energy source. So for example, your liver stores long chains of glucose molecules strung together, and those long chains, when they're all strung together, are called glycogen. And the energy that's trapped in the molecules of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen bonded together within that carbohydrate is the energy that we then use to manufacture something called ATP, adenosine triphosphate. You're going to learn about ATP in our next lecture. It's a type of nucleic acid. ATP is the energy currency of the cell. It is the molecule that we use to store energy for quick use. So what we do is we take sugar molecules, we break apart their chemical bonds, and as we break apart the chemical bonds, energy is released, and we use that energy to manufacture these ATP molecules. We will learn more about that. That's a process called oxidative respiration in a few more chapters. Now, one thing to note about carbohydrates, when you store them in the body, they have about 4.3 kilocalories of energy per mole. That's about half of what you see with lipids. So if, for example, you were to store 4.3 kilocalories of sugar in your body, it would take up about twice as much room as the same amount of lipids, because lipids contain about 9 kilocalories per mole of energy in them. And this is the main reason why your body stores fat as its primary storage source and not carbohydrates. And we should all be happy about that, because as much fat as we all have, and we don't like having it, if we had to store an equivalent amount of energy in our body in the form of carbohydrates, we would have twice as much weight of carbohydrates as compared to lipids. So it's probably a good thing we store fat and not carbohydrates. Another defining characteristic of carbohydrates that probably seems obvious is that they are hydrophilic. That means they are water-loving, and the reason that they are is the presence of those oxygen molecules, remember, causes those partial positive and negative charges to occur, just like in a water molecule. If you remember, oxygen is a very electron-greedy molecule. It tends to keep the electrons close to it, which generates that partial negative charge, causing the hydrogens to have partial positive charges. Well, as you can see in these different examples of carbohydrates here, all these carbohydrates have oxygens and hydrogens in them. And That oxygen, again, is electron greedy. It just is going to pull the electrons closer to it and farther away from the hydrogens, and in the process create those partial positive and negative charges that are going to make it very easy for those sugars to dissolve in water. Therefore, they're hydrophilic. One other thing to point out about carbohydrates on this page, you'll notice that some of the examples of carbohydrates that I've shown you are straight chains, like this one here I'm circling, while others appear in a ring shape. You can have either. It just depends on the particular carbohydrate molecule. So don't get into a line of thinking that, oh, all carbohydrates form ring structures or all carbohydrates are straight lines. They're not. They can be either or. All right, let's continue on and talk about saccharides. Saccharides is just another fancy name for carbohydrate. Okay, so you can use those two terms interchangeably, and you should be comfortable using them interchangeably. You will often hear of different types of saccharides, for example, monosaccharides versus disaccharides versus polysaccharides. A monosaccharide means a single sugar molecule, so for example, glucose, or fructose, or galactose. And by the way, the chemical formula for glucose, which you should know absolutely, is C6H12O6. It has 6 carbons present. Disaccharides occur when you join together two monosaccharides. As the name implies, di means two. So for example, the disaccharide sucrose is a combination of a single molecule of glucose with a single molecule of fructose. Lactose, another example, is a combination of one molecule of glucose with one molecule of galactose. Lastly are polysaccharides. Polysaccharides, as the name implies, poly means many. This is when I have, anytime I have more than 2 saccharides all joined together. And these chains can actually be really huge and very long, and I want to take you through a few examples that you can see on this table here. The first one I'll talk about is starch. Starch is a common carbohydrate that we consume in our diet. For example, potatoes have lots of starch in them. And that starch is just long strings of glucose molecules joined together, and then you can see that they form kind of a helix or a spiraling pattern. Sometimes that spiraling pattern will have branches off of it. Starch is a very common carbohydrate manufactured by plants. Another example that's very similar to starch, but instead of being made by plants is made by us in our liver, is that molecule called glycogen that I mentioned previously. And glycogen is also long strings of glucose molecules, and they kind of spiral the way the starch does, but notice that they have a lot more branches coming off them and side chains coming off them than we see commonly in a starch molecule. Again, glycogen is manufactured by the liver. It's found naturally in your body. Third example of a polysaccharide is cellulose. And right now, if you're taking notes in this class, you're more than likely writing on cellulose. Cellulose is the molecule we use for making of paper, and it's manufactured by trees and plants. It is an undigestible type of carbohydrate that we consume in our diet. We can eat in our diet, but that does not get digested in our food. In our stomach. And it is a combination also of a slightly different version of glucose molecules, but look here at the structure. Instead of having these long chains, we have these big sheets of cross-linked sugar molecules. It forms a very rigid structure that gives a lot of rigidity and strength where it's created. So for example, if we look at the cells of plants, plants have surrounding the outside of every cell something called a cell wall, and that cell wall is manufactured from this glucose, which again, as I said, is a very rigid and strong material. It helps give shape and structure to the cell. Another example, chitin. Chitin is interesting. It's very similar, as you can see here, to what we see in cellulose, except for that it has, instead of glucose molecules, it has something called N-acetylglutamine, and it's a little bit different sugar, but the idea of the layout, as you can see, is very similar. We have this big grid-like pattern that's all rigidly joined. Chitin you find in a couple different places. One place is fungus. Okay, fungi also have a cell wall like plants do, but their cell wall, instead of being made of cellulose like in plants, is made of chitin. Another place you see chitin is in arthropods. All of those things like insects, crabs, lobsters, those are all examples of different types of arthropods, and they have what's called an exoskeleton, or a very rigid outer structure to them, and that exoskeleton is made of chitin. So you see chitin in lots of different places. Lastly, this one here, peptidoglycan, is an interesting molecule that is found as the cell wall of bacterial cells. So again, we have another type of organism that has a very different kind of cell wall. Plants had cellulose, fungi had chitin, and now bacteria, we're saying, have peptidoglycan as their cell wall. It contains a couple different types of sugar molecules joined together in a very interesting pattern here. Peptidoglycan, it turns out, is a common target for antibiotics. For example, penicillin is a type of antibiotic that disrupts the manufacture of a peptidoglycan cell wall in bacteria, and so the bacteria end up not being able to manufacture a functional cell wall, and they end up dying. All right, last up I want to talk about very quickly is what we use carbohydrates for, and I already talked about this a little bit. I remind you again that carbohydrates only store about 4.5 kilocalories per mole of energy, which is about half that of what we get in lipids. So we use them a little bit for an energy source in the body. As I said again, the liver makes glycogen, but overall lipids tend to be our primary energy storage source. One thing carbohydrates are really good at in the body is serving as a cell recognition system. Our immune system has to be able to tell which cells in the body are part of us and which cells in the body might be a foreign invader that they need to destroy. And the way that they do that is they look for the presence of uniquely shaped sugar molecules on the outside of the plasma membrane of our cells. This here is the plasma membrane, which we're going to learn about more in just a couple weeks. This green blob here is a protein, and sticking to the outside of the protein, these red hexagonal shaped molecules are sugars that are attached. A really good example of this, if you've ever heard of the ABO blood typing system, where people either have type O blood or A or AB positive or whatever, all of those designations of O, of A, of B, of being positive, of being negative, is all a result of the presence of a different combination of sugar groups dangling off the outside of those cells. And again, that's there primarily, one of the most important reasons why it's there, is to allow our immune system to be able to distinguish our cells from invader cells. And that's really all we're going to talk about with regard to carbohydrates. As I said before, it's probably the simplest of the 4 organic molecules in terms of our discussions. Next up, we're going to be looking at nucleic acids.